Good evening, everyone. Welcome. Thank you so much for joining us this evening. My name is Lynn O'Hara, and I'm the Director of Programs for National History Day. We're so excited to be here for our second installment for our 2016 contest season Ask the Expert series. And we're very, very grateful to have an expert with us tonight from the Smithsonian National Museum of American History. John Grinspan not only works as a curator at the history, but also is a writer for the New York Times, so we'll meet him in a little bit. Also want to introduce you to our other guests joining us. I've got Cheryl Caskey. Cheryl is the National History Day in Kentucky coordinator, and Brian Bonham. Brian is not only a professor of European history at Youngstown State University, he is also the coordinator for Region 9 in Ohio. And finally, joining us with some of her students' questions is Amy Dreyer. Amy is a teacher at Calvert High School in Calvert, Maryland, and also an NHD coach there. So, welcome everybody. Thank you so much for taking your time to join us tonight. What I'd like to do is introduce kind of our first guest. John Grinspan is an Associate Curator and Jefferson Fellow at the Smithsonian National Museum of American History, which I like to jokingly call the mothership, down in Washington, D.C. He's also has his PhD from the University of Virginia, and he writes frequently for places like the Journal of American History and also the New York Times. So he's going to be our first expert to talk about writing. And one thing that I would mention, while we're going to focus specifically tonight on National History Day papers, one of the secrets of History Day is that absolutely every NHD student is a writer. So a lot of the tips and suggestions that our team will have tonight are things that are applicable to all NHD students regardless of category. Now, one thing I want to mention, we want you to join us live. So those of you who are watching us live, you can go on Twitter and send your questions or comments. Send them using the hashtag NHD Hangouts. Make sure to put the S on the end of that. And Gary Pettit, NHD's Director of Communications, is live on Twitter. He'll respond to some of your questions, share some ideas, and I'm going to take some of those Twitter questions and ask them live to the experts this hour. So let's get in and get started. Don't forget, hashtag NHD Hangouts. John, I want to start off with you, and I should probably fess up to a little secret. At History Day, we're not supposed to have a favorite category, but I was a National History Day paper writer as a kid, and I secretly love to write, and it's the best part of my job right now is that I get to write an awful lot, probably more than I ever imagined. And I wanted to ask you, what is it that you love about writing? What gets your attention, and what's the best part about it for you?
Well, first of all, thanks for having me, Lynn. I'm so excited to participate in this. I never participated as a kid in National History Day, but I really wish I had. I wish I'd known about it. I feel like I missed out on something great. And the question was, what do I love about writing?
Yes, what do you love about it?
I love that writing, especially about history, you can really organize and structure and say exactly what you mean ultimately. Then in conversations, you make offhand comments, you're not completely organized and thinking everything through. Writing is your opportunity to set everything out and make your argument and think about who you're talking to, what you want to tell them, what you want them to take away, almost as a frozen conversation where you can plan out every little step. And if you're a neurotic person like me, that's great because you can think everything through ahead of time.
NHD papers could also be good for students who might be a little more shy or reserved, especially students for whom a performance category might scare them. This is kind of an interesting alternative because you really do get to plan out everything you're going to see and everything the judges are going to see up until the point where you go into that interview.
And on top of that, it's neutral. Writing is writing. It's all the same text. It'll all be submitted in the same font probably. It's not a question of how loud you can shout or what font you can use or where you're coming from or what your background is. It still affects everything, but writing is your best shot at neutrality. And the best writing will stand out no matter who wrote it.
I think that's a really good point. And I think writing stands on its own in some ways better than some of our other categories. Because remember, the judges are going to get your paper several weeks before you even come to a contest. And they're going to sit down in their comfy chair and approach your paper uniquely. One of the things, there's definitely some challenges that our students face when they start to write their papers. Can you give me some challenges that you face as a writer and some of the things you do to overcome them?
Oh, sometimes it feels like I only face challenges. First challenge I would say is actually over-preparing. Not that you shouldn't prepare and plan out what you're going to say, but there's a possibility that you just think too much. And that's how procrastination builds up. If it becomes this mental hurdle where you're worried about writing this paper and you're thinking about saying everything you've ever wanted to say in 1 or 2 pages or whatever, it's going to make it very hard to do. So sometimes I think whittling down what you want to say into coherent points and knowing exactly what you want to say, what each paragraph should say, and the points you're trying to make are really how I jump into anything. That and a strong cup of coffee are, to me, so much stronger than any large, elaborate plan about explaining all of history in a couple pages. The other thing I'll say, number one preparation actually for me, is taking a walk. No earbuds in, no distractions, go for a walk, think it through, articulate it to yourself before you start writing. That's how everything I've ever written has started with a long walk.
Every writer has those interesting traditions. You talk about going for a walk. But one thing that sometimes catches students is this idea of writer's block. They have an idea, they might have a thesis statement, but they sit down to start writing because they know that they have to turn a draft in to their teacher or their NHD coach, whether it's in a week or maybe in the morning. And they really kind of look at the cursor on the screen and they get stuck. What are some tips you can give students as they're trying to get started to get past that initial fear of putting something on paper?
I mean, the number one thing to do is get away from it for a little while. Like I said, go for a walk, do something, nothing that will really occupy you. Don't go see a movie, but don't sit staring at a blank screen for too long because it'll build up on you. People always say skip the first paragraph or the introduction. Try to write the middle of the paper. Try to write the last paragraph. Think about if you were having an actual conversation with another person sitting right across from you, what would you want them to know about your paper, and expand from there. The other thing you can remember is we're using computers. You can delete and throw out anything you want. So it's better to just start writing and write absolute garbage for 20 minutes and get to something good than to stare at a blank screen. Remember, everything about writing is editing and choosing what to cut and what to keep. So it doesn't matter if your first draft is perfect.
Well, and chances are it won't be, but we'll get to revisions in just a little bit. I like that idea about, kind of making this like a conversation. If you were going to tell your best friend and explain to them about your topic, what are the most important things that you want to know? But when you write, and you write for different forms of media, so whether you're writing a blog post or a newspaper article or more of a formal academic paper, what are some ways that you approach the process of writing to make sure that in the end you have a product that's successful, whether it's for your editor or your boss or your professor?
Well, number one thing is to think about your audience. All writing is not the same. All writing is not neutral in value. So think who is going to read this and what are they looking for and what do you want them to know. You would write something very differently to a friend than you would to your boss. I write for academic scholarly sources and for public sources, and when I'm writing for academics, I can assume they have this deep background in history that your average reader might not. So I try to think who's going to read this and how would I tell them what I want to tell them. You just tailor everything to them in that sense. What was the rest of the question?
Well, what are some other ways that you approach so you mentioned that approaching your audience is important, to think about who your reader is. And I think that's a good point, because sometimes I always tell students to think of an NHD judge as a very intelligent person who may or may not know anything about the topic you're going to present.
Yes.
What are some other things you have to consider when you start writing outside of your audience?
Don't assume everyone knows what you know. Once you start researching history, it gets in your head and you think, the more you read, the more you feel like this information is in my head, it must be in everyone's head. And you get so far from the average person's area of knowledge that you can't communicate with them anymore. I mean, a lot of the greatest historians out there run into this trap where they can only communicate with the other people who know what they know. And that's not the goal of history. We're trying to interact with people who tell them something new. So don't get too in your head, and also remember what initially attracted you to the subject. It's possible, I think it frequently happens, that people have a good idea in the beginning, and they do more research, and they think about it more and more, and they lose track of what they initially attracted them to the subject when they knew very little about it. So I think the way to go is to always kind of keep track of, why did I care about this to begin with? If I was passionate about this 3 weeks ago, what got me passionate about it when I knew nothing? Try to empathize with your former self who didn't know the research that you've done.
Well, and bringing in the cool factor. Whatever made it cool and interesting to you is probably going to appeal to somebody else in your audience.
Yes, absolutely. And there are always a couple topics that you can get that extra cool factor that you can sometimes I think about what is the sugar you can get to give somebody to get the medicine go down. And there are topics that will get people's attention. If there's any action in your story, if they're real humans you can empathize within your story, if there's food in what you're talking about. These little things that just attract people, get them in, and then you can really give them the real history.
Absolutely. Now, here's something that a lot of students have trouble with, in that when they're writing historical papers, especially if it's the first time they're writing a historical paper, because remember, our students are grades 6 to 12, and most sixth graders haven't written a paper that's
Yeah.
1,500 to 2,500 words when they start. One of the things that they struggle with is they struggle to understand the difference between writing narrative, which is just writing what happened and putting the facts in order, and making an argument, about making an argument in your writing and how it is you go about doing that.
I think a good way to think about it, you may not have written papers, but you've read books. Think back to a book you read a year ago. You're not going to remember all the details. You probably won't even remember the plot twists of the story. But if the book had one argument in it, you might remember that. And think, you know so much in your head about the topic you're writing about, but most people don't. So you want to let them walk away from the subject with one perfect, clean sentence of what the topic is about. And a good way to do that is to actually write down in a single sentence, single short sentence, what you're writing about. You don't have to include it in your paper, but if you can write and express it to yourself, you can express it to someone else. So just remember, people have limited amount of information they can remember. People have a lot going on in their lives. People will read a lot of these papers. Give them the sense that there's a single sentence, a single coherent idea that you want them to take away.
That's a really good strategy, because one thing students might want to think of is either putting that at the top of their paper or maybe even sticking a post-it note on their desk or on their computer, because one of the things that we have to do is edit as writers, and sometimes you might want to say, okay, does this fact or this story or this idea tie back to the sentence? And if it does, great, we want to keep it. And if it doesn't, and it's just kind of a cool story, maybe that's one of those things where we go, oh, maybe we need to edit that out.
The best stuff, the stuff you cut is always going to be the best stuff. It's always those cool little details that you love, but just don't tie in with the larger thing you're trying to do. So you're always going to cut some bits you love. The other thing, though, is it's important to be able to express in a sentence what you're working on, but don't be too wedded to an initial sentence. Sometimes you start writing about one thing, and the paper turns into some other subject, and you realize at the end that that's really what you wanted to write all along, and that's the better subject. So as long as at some point, as long as at the end of the day you can say, this is what I'm writing about, don't worry too much if you realize halfway through you found a better thing to write about. I think that happens especially with students a lot.
Well, I think that shows a maturity as a writer to say, you know what, I thought I was going this direction, but I'm actually finding, especially if your historical evidence is leading you somewhere differently, don't be afraid of that.
Yeah, and I think, I can't speak for the judges and the evaluators, but they're looking for the strongest arguments. They're not looking for the argument that you wanted to write. They don't know what you initially were thinking. They don't know what you set out to do. So as long as the final product is strong, don't worry about whether it was your initial project or you came up with it and changed your mind in the last minute and wrote a better paper. And that's, again, I'm going to sound crazy, but going for a walk, again, at the end of the paper is good to think through, did I write what I wanted to? Is this really what I wanted to say? And is what I'm saying better than what I initially set out for? Have I really expressed what I needed to?
Those are all good tips. Can we talk a little more about this revision process and the idea that sometimes you need to cut, change, edit? Can you give some tips for students while they're, especially because many of our students at this point of the year might have a rough draft that they're trying to work on and clean up for a school contest or a regional contest. What tips can you give them in terms of revision?
Revision is my favorite part, honestly. The writing, it's always stressful and difficult. Revision is, like I said, that point when you can decide this sentence I'm keeping, this I'm cutting, where you can really orchestrate the perfect argument. And think about it, if you're dumping a crate full of objects onto a table, revision is where you pick your favorite pieces. You can cut whatever you want. You're not tied to anything. A tip for that I like to do, and I think this really helps, is print out your paper. Physically print it out, read it out loud to yourself. It'll look crazy, but you'll see how it reads to somebody else. If you wrote it on a screen, you're so used to seeing it in Microsoft Word or whatever, changing how you look at it will give you some objectivity. And you can realize this paragraph doesn't work or this sentence is wrong. Print it out or look at it on another device, look at it, read it on your phone if you've written it on a computer. You can change on Microsoft Word how you view from web view to print view or whatever. You can do that. Anything to give you a little distance and objectivity really helps. And can they have other people look at it too?
Absolutely. We encourage students to revise, to get feedback, whether that's from peers, other adults, teachers. Don't forget your school librarians. They tend to be really, really good research helpers and helpers on your papers especially.
Then don't be modest. People write things and they put so much work into them that they're very protective of them, and that's understandable, but it will be better if someone else looks at it. Don't worry. No one's going to tell you it's terrible. Get some feedback. The best writers do. The worst writers are the ones who can't let their stuff be looked at. The real good writers have friends, have family members, have teachers who they trust to give them some opinion. And the other thing is, I know this is hard to do, write early and give it time to breathe. The best thing you can do is write your paper now or coming up and let it sit for a while before you submit it so that you can see it objectively. Let your mind clear out, forget what you say, and return to it.
Absolutely. Another thing for students to remember is that you can revise in between stages of the contest. So if your teacher gives you feedback in school and you're preparing to go to a regional contest, it's really important to listen to the comments that your teacher had to say. In the end, you're still the author. You decide what changes to make and what things to keep. But I think it's important to be open and listen to the ideas that the judges have, because oftentimes they're more right than they're not.
Yeah.
All right, let me throw one other question your way, and this is something that our students kind of struggle with sometimes. Primary sources. When they're using primary sources in their papers, what are some ways to bring the sources into the paper while avoiding putting giant chunks of quoted text into their paper?
There are times in their mediums where you can use big block quotes, but in my opinion, you're usually better off not using them. They are not your writing. It's not your words. There are times and places for it. I think in a paper like this, you're probably better off expressing your own or quoting in short quotes. Ways to get around it. You can often tell what somebody is saying without quoting them. I don't know any easy ways to go around it in terms of that.
Well, I think it's also important for students to remember that they can describe and explain. So they don't necessarily have to use a full paragraph from Queen Elizabeth's speech. Instead, they might, describe the important message and maybe use a quote of a key phrase or an idea, something that comes up again and again without having to use the whole thing. Because I know sometimes when I write, I like quotes, and sometimes I put too much in my first draft. And then I go back and reread it and go, okay, I put 3 sentences of a quote, but I really just need these 7 words. And that can be important in a paper where you have a word limit.
I think a short quote is always going to have more punch and impact than a long quote. That you think the longer the quote, the more thorough you're being. But the more people read, the more removed they are from your writing and your thesis. So you can think of quotes as hot sauce you sprinkle on top of a dish. It's this little biting bit that gets people, wakens them up and shows them that there's something interesting. But you don't want to dredge it in hot sauce. You want to make the majority of your writing your writing. And the fewer quotes, the shorter quotes you use, I think the more punch they have.
Excellent. Okay, well, that's a lot of good ideas, and I think it's like we've lost Amy Dreyer, but that's okay. We're going to ask a couple more questions, and hopefully Amy will be able to rejoin us in just a few minutes. Cheryl, I'm going to actually pass this over to you. Cheryl Caskey is our NHD and Kentucky coordinator. And don't forget, anybody who's watching live, send your questions using hashtag NHD Hangouts. We want to ask some of them live on air. First question I've got here. How much of a paper should be background information? Can you talk a little bit about historical context and how much time and space in a paper you should devote to it?
Yeah, I'll see what I can offer as far as advice here. So obviously all parts of your or NHG projects all need to have that context so that you're kind of setting the scene for your topic and your argument, and you're not just starting with this day in history and then my topic. So you want to devote a little bit of time to what was going on at the same time as your event and directly before as well, so that you're kind of setting the scene. But you don't want to take up necessarily the entire paper. So kind of a good idea to think about is your paper is between 5 to 10 pages long. And so after you kind of get through your introduction, I would say maybe 2 to 3 paragraphs of really that background and context information before you start getting into your argument can kind of help your paper without beating people over the head. Don't know if anyone else has any other suggestions for that context question.
Well, I can steal an idea from a friend of mine who works at the National Archives, and when she talks with students about context, she talks about big C and little c. So she says, okay, if you're going to talk about Rosa Parks on the bus, you've got to mention that there's a civil rights movement going on and what's happening nationally. That doesn't mean telling about every single event that's happened before Rosa Parks got on that bus. But you also want to talk about little c. What's going on in that town with that law in that state? And then if you can kind of hit on a little bit of both, but be careful because you don't have a whole lot of time. Like Cheryl said, 2, maybe 3 paragraphs, that's about it. If you find that you've written 2 or 3 pages of background, that's a good sign you've got to edit it down and kind of tighten it up a little bit. Cheryl, another question for you. Focusing on the theme. How much of a paper should be focused on the NHD theme, and how can you do that? And
this one I always find a little bit tough because the theme is how you're framing your argument and your topic. So it's helping you to understand your topic within the context of a theme so that you're not just kind of going all over the place, giving every little bit of detail about your particular topic and what you want to say about it. But that doesn't necessarily mean that in every paragraph you have to say exploration, encounter, and exchange. But I think the thing to keep in mind is that any piece of evidence that you are using, any of your main points, should be supporting your thesis statement. And your thesis statement is meant to directly relate and reference that theme. So if you go through your paper and you find that you have a supporting point and evidence that isn't really relating to your thesis, then that's kind of a good indicator that it's not relating to that theme because it's not supporting your thesis statement. So you're not necessarily saying, you know, all 3 parts of the theme throughout your paper, but in theory, everything is tying back to that thesis statement, which is connected to the theme.
One good tip there. Students, go ahead when you have a draft of your paper and take a highlighter and you get to highlight 1 sentence per paragraph to show how it connects to your argument. If you're connecting to your argument in every paragraph, it's good. If you don't really have a sentence to highlight, that's a good sign that maybe that paragraph needs to go on the chopping block floor. Maybe it's interesting and it's great, but it's just not the best thing to go into your paper. Okay. Amy, we've got you back. Can I go ahead and ask you to give us one of your questions, some of the questions from your students at Calvert High?
Sure. So one of my questions that a student has is how a paper can best exhibit, for lack of a better word, their project. Why is a paper better than, say, an exhibit or a website or even a documentary when they can have more video, more photographs, more visual sources? So I have a student that's doing, for example, Tiananmen Square, the encounters and the exchanges that took place there. And they want to know would that make it a good paper when they can have a limited number of visual sources in an appendix when that's such a visual topic?
Well, that's a good question. I'm going to pass that to Brian, and then I'm also going to go ahead and pass that to John. What tips can you give? What kinds of topics make really good papers? And what are some reasons why a student should choose a paper over one of the other categories? Brian, what do you think?
Well, I think there are 2 sort of categories of answer to that. One thing is you need to think about yourself. What are you good at? Am I the sort of person who can best communicate in a paper? If I'm a a theatrical person and I'm very comfortable in front of a crowd, perhaps the best thing for me to do is a performance. Maybe that's the sort of thing I'm good at. There are people who are good at expressing themselves in writing. So I think part of the question is not only about the subject, it's about the person writing. Is writing the medium through which I can communicate most effectively? If you think you're a good writer, then probably you should be writing. If you struggle with writing, but you're just naturally great with putting together websites, maybe you should go with websites. So part of it is about you. What are you good at? And then I think the other part is the subject itself. What are you trying to communicate? If what you're trying to communicate is a lot about the sort of subtlety of a person's characteristics and their body language and the way they approach something on a political stage, perhaps you need to do a performance and kind of impersonate them in a sense, because that's what you're trying to put across. On the other hand, if you want to develop some subtlety of argument, a paper is probably the best way to go. As one of the earlier speakers mentioned, a paper gives you a chance to really sit down and craft something very carefully. And you can develop, I think, a greater sophistication and subtlety of argument through writing than perhaps you can in some of the other media. So it's a little bit about who are you and what do you do best, and it's also a little bit about what are you trying to communicate and what would be the best format for communicating that.
John, can I also toss that question off to you? What are your thoughts?
Well, I absolutely agree with Brian. I think subtlety is one of the benefits of writing. That if you make a documentary, if you do a play, these things are great, but they're often sledgehammers, and writing is a scalpel. That every word you use, every comma you use in writing can modulate your arguments slightly and adjust what you're doing slightly. And it gives you more control than a film documentary ever could. That doesn't mean that everyone has to do it. There are people who are naturally great performers and should perform instead of write. What I will say in defense of writing, in addition to subtlety, is I think it's the most information-dense way to approach. People talk about nutrient-dense foods, things that have a lot of calories versus things that have a few calories. Writing, you can get more information, more points, more arguments into a space than you can in any other means of communication. People say a picture's worth 1,000 words. It's not really true when it comes to giving people information and argument and thesis. I really think writing is the way you can get the most in the smallest amount of space.
May I add one thing as well?
Please do.
Yeah, I agree very much with everything John said. Another thing to consider is when you submit a paper, that will be read ahead of time, and the person who's reading it is not bound to finish it in a certain number of minutes. They can sit and read it and think about it. When you do a documentary, or correct me if I'm wrong here, by the way, when you do the documentary or the poster board or any of these sorts of things, there's a specific, the judges come by and they look at it. And it's a slightly different experience. I think if you've written a paper and somebody is reading it kind of privately before the event and then talking to you about the paper at the event, again, I agree with what you said about nutrient dense. You can kind of get more information across, and I think that is one of the things that makes a paper kind of unique.
Absolutely. And, History Day students always have the idea that they're going to find the easy NHD project. And I always remind them that there's no easy. There's just different kinds of challenge.
Yeah, and I think the idea is to figure out what you're good at and how you can best express yourself and then pick that format.
Definitely. Let me toss out a question from Twitter. I'm actually going to toss this to John and to Cheryl. What are some of the best primary sources you could use in a paper? And maybe some that we wouldn't necessarily think of. And something that you've written, what's a neat primary source and how would you bring it into a paper?
I'm going to let John take that one first.
I was going to defer to you. Great source that you can use and is keyword searchable online are narratives recorded by the WPA, the Works Progress Administration, in the 1930s. They interviewed a lot of Americans. They interviewed former slaves. They interviewed Dust Bowl farmers. And these are recorded online. They're on the Library of Congress website, American Memory, keyword searchable transcripts of people's daily lives and their conversation, their experiences. Now, interviews are not written sources. They're a little different. There's some questions about when you should trust them, when you shouldn't. But if you're looking for primary sources to put you in touch with American history, those are a great place to start, I think.
I would agree. I was going to say,
because a lot of students think about an interview, but struggle in quoting it. So I'm sorry. Go ahead, Cheryl. What other ideas might you have for this student?
Sorry, I was just thinking the same kinds of thing is that, we always think about letters and diaries and things like that, which are great sources for papers because they are written, but that the kinds of oral histories or other kinds of audio sources that they can think of, speeches, for example, I think can also make really good sources for a paper, because then the student can take out the parts of the speech or the oral history that they want to use, and they don't necessarily have to use it as a direct quote, but they can, again, going back to that paraphrasing and using it, but it's getting them away from those textual documents that sometimes they might not have often for their kinds of papers. So I say that they could look for speeches. Even songs, for example, could be really good for a kind of for a paper, because it's not necessarily, again, those manuscripts or diary entries or things like that, but it's still a written text that they can pull from, and again, could make pretty good quotes for their paper.
And just to add to that, you can tailor what sources you use to what you're trying to express. I think that's something also to think about, that if you want to show someone's interior life, a diary is a very good source because it's an intimate, private document. If you want to show how someone saw themselves and thought others should think, a letter or a speech is a great way to find somebody in the past trying to articulate to other people their worldview. So think about what you're trying to do first before you start looking for different sources, I guess.
Let me add something there as well. I think another category of primary sources that is useful to look at is local primary sources. Students very often tend to gravitate to sort of national and well-known topics. There's a huge wealth of primary sources from local historical societies, local museums, all sorts of local newspapers and things like this. And very often you can come up with an extremely interesting project by doing something that's very local. And the sources you use of necessity are going to be things that are fairly unique. Not everyone's going to use them because not many people live in your particular locality. And then you kind of link those to a larger national or international framework. But using local sources, I think, is something that I would urge students to think about.
Sorry.
That's okay. I was just going to say I can feed on that as a History Day teacher. I've got a couple of boys that are doing the Oyster Wars. I had no idea what the Oyster Wars were until it was presented to me. We live in between the Chesapeake Bay and the Potomac River here in Maryland, and the Oyster Wars were basically what the Department of Natural Resources for Maryland came from. So I've got local history that my kids are doing this year that I'm really excited to see a project on.
Right. And I think a lot of the times judges will be intrigued by things like that. I mean, it's very. I've judged History Day 11 years now, or 11 years, and I mean there are certain things that come up over and over again. You always get topics on World War II and certain other topics, and it does catch the eye in a sense when you see something like you mentioned the Oyster Wars. I would immediately think, oh, Oyster Wars, what's that? And it's nice to sort of make that impression on the judges to get them kind of curious about some things.
I was just going to add one last thing to the kinds of sources playing on the local history thing got me thinking. You can also think about, if depending on your topic again, things like buttons, political buttons can be interesting sources, I think, for papers, depending on what your topic is. Signs and posters can be drawn into, I think, papers. Again, if I'm thinking if you're doing a topic on military exploration in some way, or different encounters, for example, between protesters or things like that within a paper, thinking outside that box. And again, a lot of museums and libraries will have things like that digitized and archived available for students to find.
Absolutely. And I think you all have made a lot of good points about using a variety of sources. It's not about, we get asked all the time at History Day, how many sources do I need to have in my annotated bibliography? And there is no good answer for that because it totally depends on your topic. But I think what's most important is to have a variety. So, for example, if you're doing a project on Lewis and Clark, I'd be looking for a map somewhere in that bibliography. I'd be looking for an account. I'd be looking for a sketch or a drawing. And if you're writing a paper, that doesn't mean you can't watch a documentary. It doesn't mean you can't look at some art or photographs. That, this variety of sources is really what makes a good NHD project and teaches you a lot of skills as an NHD student. Okay, I've got another question I want to throw out. I'm going to start with John on this one. One of our students on Twitter is asking about organization. What's the best way to organize your information when you're writing a paper? Can you talk a little bit about how you organize your thoughts when you're writing?
I mean, I can tell you what works for me, but I should say that different people have different approaches. If you have an approach that works, keep it up, right? So there are people who will just start writing, start with the first sentence, and write stream of consciousness and get to the end and write perfect papers. I'm not one of those people. I need to plan out everything in an outline. So I spend more time writing an outline usually than I spend writing an article or a paper or whatever. And the outline is broken down by paragraph. First, what I do is I take all my notes. I guess here's how I go. And I read through my notes once I've taken them in one big sitting. I read through them all, and I create a Word file that I call issues. And I create headings within the issues file of the different themes I want to address, the different arguments I want to make, the different who, what, where, when, why kind of things I have to do. And then I try to figure out what's the best way to present all these issues. And I get an outline from that. And usually an outline will be single sentences for each paragraph, and maybe some quotes I want to include in that paragraph so that I know that I will hit the points I want in the right order. And that's how I write. There are people who just start writing and write it perfectly, well, not the first time. There are people who just start writing and write everything in one go. To me, the outline and the editing are more important than the typing everything down.
Other suggestions from the group, other approaches to organization that you or students you've worked with have found useful?
Well, I'll offer one suggestion. As John said, there is no one right way to write, and people write differently, but just a suggestion. First paragraph should essentially introduce the subject. By the end of the first paragraph, the reader should be basically aware of what this paper is going to be about. Perhaps the second paper should develop the thesis. By the end of the second paragraph, we should know essentially what the main argument is. So the first one sort of introduces the topic. Second paragraph introduces the author's thesis. And then from there on, you basically work paragraph by paragraph developing the thesis. I think it's often a good idea to divide your paper into sections with headings, partly to help the reader understand the organization of the paper, but also to help the writer organize the paper into sections. That's one way of thinking about it. We also want a paragraph somewhere near the beginning, perhaps the third paragraph, that says just a little bit about the what's been written on this topic, so what we might call a historiographical paragraph. Give us some sense of who's written on this and what's been said about this thing before. So perhaps to go through those first three paragraphs again, what the topic is, what the author's thesis is, and what's kind of been said about this before. Those are the first three paragraphs. That's just one suggestion. There are other decent ways to write a paper, but when students say they have no clue how to do it, I offer that as a sort of a template.
Absolutely. And those headers might be helpful for students, even if they decide in the end to take them out. A lot of times they're helpful while you're writing. At the end, you can still make the decision. Although, keep in mind, if you keep them in, they count towards your words because they are part of your words. But, again, that's a strategy that you can keep in all the way to the day you submit it to make that decision. I'm sorry, John, go ahead.
Oh, I was going to add to that. Brian reminded me. One principle that I think often helps is to remember to make your writing as consumable as possible. And if you just write in huge paragraphs, 300-word paragraphs in big, long blocks, it's very hard for a reader's mind to kind of get around it. So if you break things up more, if you use shorter paragraphs, if you use sections and section headings, it just makes it easier for a reader to break it down and understand it. I think of it, this might be a weird metaphor, but I think of it almost as you're marinating. And if you're marinating meat or whatever, the smaller the piece, the more surface area is exposed. So often I try to have shorter paragraphs and more sections to let the reader's mind marinate and to understand what I'm saying, as opposed to just saying it all in one gigantic paragraph.
Yeah, good kind of rule of thumb I always tell students is that a paragraph typed double space should be about half a page. If your paragraph goes over a page, it's either a really long paragraph that needs some edits, or it might be 2 or maybe even 3 paragraphs, and that's okay because History Day papers don't need to be 5-paragraph essays, and often are much more, and that's kind of something that some of our students have to kind of break out of a little bit.
Can I just ask a quick question to the group?
Okay. I'm going to toss it back to you for another question.
Thank you.
Please
It kind
do.
of goes along with this outlining. So what I'm afraid I'm going to get from my students this year doing papers is that they are mostly connecting to all three of the themes. And so what I'm afraid I'm going to get is they're going to give me, here's the exploration, followed by here's the encounter, followed by here's the exchange, which happens to go chronologically. And so I'm afraid of getting those storied papers that are connecting to the theme, but that it's going to be that choppy, here's the exploration, here's the encounter, here's the exchange, still telling a story and not really hitting that analysis point.
Yeah, that's a difficult question. I think, I mean, first of all, correct me if I'm wrong, Lynn, but you are only required to hit one of the three topics, isn't that correct?
Correct. The official, and I'll make an official NHD statement here, you do not need to use all three, exploration, encounter, and exchange. However, we tell students not to skip logical connections. So if you're going to tell me that Christopher Columbus encountered the New World, but didn't exchange anything and nothing went back and forth, your argument's going to fall apart pretty quickly. But that it's okay to focus on one or two, do whatever's logical for the topic and the way your research is leading you.
Right. And then the second thing to say is that they're really not discrete, separate categories. It's very difficult to explore without encountering and to without doing all of these things together, really. So I would encourage your students not to think about it as three separate words, but as three words describing one phenomenon. It is essentially one thing, and that's probably the way to think about it, as a sort of a unitary whole experience.
And I'll suggest something, and Lynn, you can tell me if I'm crazy or not for thinking about this, but if they are thinking about their topic within the context of all three or two parts of the theme, maybe one way of helping them organize their thoughts is to take what they are thinking of as their supporting points for their argument and just writing out how they see that one particular argument or supporting point relating to exploration, relating to encounter, relating to exchange, and then that'll kind of help them tie them all together in theory. I think one sort of tool that might help them.
Mm-hmm. One tip I might give students is to go back once you have a draft and look at the last sentence of every paragraph. And I always say, okay, does it show you why this paragraph's important and how it connects to the big picture? Because it's either got to connect up or make a transition. If it doesn't do any of those things, I say sometimes the paragraph just kind of jump off the cliff. It's like the lemmings. Like, here's my facts, boom, we're going to do another paragraph with facts. But that the point of a History Day paper and the point of writing for a historical audience, which is what you're writing for here, is to make an argument, to make a case, to explain why this is important in history, to explain why this event led to that event and how it had an impact on the people or the town or the nation or the civilization. It could really be at any of those scales.
Another thing I'd suggest also to impress upon the students, and this goes back to something John said about having other people read the papers when students are writing them. It's very easy to write something and think that what you've written accurately reflects what you think you've written. But in many cases, you'll find it's very useful to write something and then give it to another person and say, please read this and tell me what I've written. Tell me what my main argument is. Tell me what my point is. And you may be surprised to find that they don't get what you meant, or that they see something different than what you thought you said. So it's very important to get that feedback. And I think getting some feedback, maybe from your parents, from a sibling, from your teacher, from anybody, if you get that feedback, you'll also probably get some of the we'll address some of those ideas about writing this very artificial paper that's in 3 sections, because people will sort of see that, I think, when they read it.
Wow, lots of good ideas there. Okay, next question. This is a student question. I'm going to toss off to Cheryl to get us going here. The question is, do we have to use footnotes for citations? Can we use in-text citations? And if so, which format should I use? APA, Chicago, MLA? Can you talk a little bit about citations in an NHD paper?
Sure. So according to the NHD rules, which I will hold this up to remind everybody, if you can see this, the NHD rulebook, which you can find on the NHD website, downloadable. You can also talk to coordinators, teachers, whoever they might have copies laying around. There are the individual rules on, I believe, page 20 is what I have here for papers. And so you can use footnotes, endnotes, or in-text citation for your papers. They do have to follow MLA or Turabian style of citation. And so you can find examples of those both within the rulebook, but also available online in various locations. And I recommend talking to your school librarian or local public librarian if you really need help finding where to find those citation examples. As far as which one will be best in an NHD paper, I think that the standard or the tradition is going to be more towards footnotes or endnotes. And from a personal perspective, were I to be writing a National History Day paper, I kind of lean towards footnotes for a couple of different reasons. I think that they help make the overall paper look a little bit neater, and the reader or the judge is not necessarily getting distracted by the in-text citations, but neither are they having to flip to the back of your paper to find your endnotes that you're talking about within the context of your sources that you're quoting. Also, footnotes kind of allow you to sometimes expand upon a point within your paper that you can't devote necessarily a full paragraph to, but you think is important enough to include in your argument. But again, it is kind of, I think, a more of a personal preference because all three are allowed within the actual National History Day rules.
Absolutely. A couple tips I'll throw out to our students. If you go on nhd.org under Classroom Connection, there's a new annotated bibliography resource that includes examples on how to footnote. So I'm going to strongly encourage students to look at that if that's something that's new to them or they're trying to learn. We also have our Making History series. That's the one thing I don't have up free on the website. Those are available for sale. But we just revised the paper book. And I was the primary author revising the paper book, so a little shameless plug there. But that's designed to help walk students through. So those are some resources we can toss out your way. But one thing I'll mention to the student, the question mentioned APA format, which is commonly used in social sciences like psychology and sociology. However, that is not allowed in NHD. It just doesn't fit the format. They format things a little bit differently. So make sure to use that Turabian Chicago style. Sometimes two names mean almost the same thing, or that MLA style. The other warning I'll tell students, pick one. Please don't try to mix them up. That never, ever, ever works. And if you're getting stuck, this is where you want to use your resources. Talk to your school librarian. Talk to your English language arts teacher. They tend to be very, very good at doing citations, and sometimes they really like it. It's kind of a dark little secret. So use those people around you who really have some expertise and would probably be more than willing to help you, provided you don't ask an hour before something's due.
May I just add something there?
Yes.
So it's perfectly fine to use MLA or Chicago/Turabian. This is just an aside. History Day is history, and you may eventually go into a history department. There's going to be lots of historians around looking at your work and so on. The history profession uses Chicago-Turabian. So, if you're thinking, do I want to invest some time learning one or the other, Chicago probably makes more sense. Mm-hmm. But either is perfectly acceptable.
Absolutely, and just pick one and go with it. And do one well. I think that's almost more important than, because when you're sloppy with your citations, it kind of makes the judge think you didn't care so much about your paper. And we know that if you put this time and effort in, taking that little extra time to have them clean and organize gives a nice, good presentation. Think about this as a professional product, just like you would write a resume or a letter, something for a job interview or a college application. This is really all the same principles coming to play in the paper. Okay, John, I have a next question. I'm going to toss it off and start this question with you. One of the things that students struggle with in papers is trying to decide when to quote and when to paraphrase. Can you give some tips on how you decide what are the best quotes to use when you write?
Quoting can be a real strength, even aside from what you're saying. If the language is really colorful, if it demonstrates, people speak differently in different times. So if it demonstrates a worldview, if you think it's kind of quaint or interesting in any way, a quote is always fun, and it always reminds people we're talking about history, we're talking about people from the past who communicated differently than we do today. I think when not to quote is when it becomes a distraction, when the quote starts to take on more brain power to comprehend than it elucidates for the reader. So if a quote is very complicated, if it has a lot of clauses, if it has a lot of language in it that's not immediately understandable, you might be better off paraphrasing so as not to distract the reader. But a good quote that gives a little sense of this different time and place you're writing about will do, a four-word quote will do what you can try to do in paragraphs. It's the closest thing to including pictures in your writing when we were talking about mediums before. So you can really give a hint, you can really do gestures to other worlds, but some quotes can drag you down and distract you as well. So really think about, is this comprehensible? How long do you have to think about it to understand it? And does it advance my argument or articulate my argument in some way?
Another good tip to think about, students, look at the quotes you want to use. You should very rarely, if ever, quote from a secondary source. Because remember, that's a historian talking about it. Whenever possible, go right to that primary source. Don't tell me what an author thought of Alexander Hamilton. Tell me what Alexander Hamilton had to say. And
Absolutely.
I think that can be really, really important. Brian, I want to toss a question out to you. One thing that sometimes students get caught up when they're writing their paper is that they get into what I call storytelling mode, where they're telling you a story, and they might be writing really well, but they forget about this idea of analysis. So what are some tips you can give students to make sure that they're analyzing their topic and not just telling us about it?
Well, one of the things I think we always look for in a good paper, whether judging History Day or being a professor at a university, is the thesis. Is a paper simply a recitation or narrative of facts that we already know, essentially? Or is there something in this paper that is specifically the opinion of the author, the opinion of the student? And what we look for is a paper that is essentially a student's opinion that makes an argument. When you've written your paper, ask yourself the question, have I made a point or an argument here that somebody could disagree with, that somebody could counter? If the answer is no, you probably haven't written a terribly good paper. What you want to do is you want to write a paper that has an argument that somebody can say, well, that's convincing and I agree with it, or I'm not sure I agree with that. I mean, it's right in that sense, but there's another argument that we could come back with. Does your paper stimulate a conversation? Perhaps that's a way to look at it. If your paper doesn't stimulate a conversation, then perhaps it's a weaker paper. So we really want something from you, some kind of argument that you've made. And of course, it's not simply good enough to make an argument at the beginning and then just narrate a series of events. You need to tie the events that you talk about to the thesis. So the whole paper really has to have that kind of theme of an argument that you are making, and you have to make your argument convincing by grounding it in evidence and telling the reader rather why your argument is convincing and why they should accept your argument.
Excellent. Now, those are all really good points, because if we can't argue with it, if it's just a statement of facts, it's kind of storytelling and not really history, because the argumentation, I think, is what makes history interesting.
I'll give you a couple of examples. Some of the work I've done is in environmental issues in Russian history. And so when the Soviet Union collapsed in 1991, a number of authors started to write that the natural environment was in pretty bad shape in the Soviet Union, in the former Soviet Union. And of course you could narrate all these facts about, health statistics and environmental things, but there was an argument that people made, and they said, well, the problems were caused by communism. So that's a thesis, right? That's an argument. The environmental problems were caused by communism, some writers said. And then other writers can say, well, I disagree with that. And so somebody came on and wrote a book that said, well, the early communist period, there was a lot of concern for the natural environment. Things went wrong a bit later in the communist period when Stalin came along. And then somebody else can say, well, maybe not, because in this particular aspect of the natural environment, Stalinist policies were actually quite good for the environment. So the idea is, are you kind of starting a conversation here? We want to have something that isn't just, here's what happened. It's actually another way I sometimes describe this to my students is, we don't want a play-by-play of the game, the football game. What we want is the after-game analysis. We want people to say why the game went this way, or why that play was good, or why that play wasn't good, or something like that.
And if I could just add to that, I think Brian's getting at the beauty of history here. That if you're doing it right, there's a good chance you're wrong some of the time. That if you're completely safe, if you're completely with the facts and the statistics on your side, the way you can be in other disciplines, it's not really history. The beauty of history is we have this whole expanse of the past to argue over and fight over, and all the best historians are wrong a lot. So you're better off taking a stand. Don't write anything ridiculous, but you're better off taking a stand and being wrong than writing the facts and not taking any stand at all, I think.
I agree.
Excellent. And I think that's a great point to end on. So I want to take a minute and thank all of our guests tonight. Thank you to Amy Dreyer from Calvert High School in Maryland, Brian Bottom, our Ohio Regional Coordinator and a professor at Youngstown State, Cheryl Caskey, our NHD in Kentucky Coordinator, and thank you, John Grinspan from the Smithsonian Museum of American History. Good luck to all of our students writing NHD papers. Check out some of the resources we've talked about tonight. Good luck writing your papers, and we can't wait to see them. Regional contest season is right around the corner. Good night, everyone.